So this is an episode, I think just for one reason or another, we've been cooking for a little while, just finding a good time, and want to make sure that we had all the time to prepare for this one. But I'm really excited to have this conversation. It's just another area, just over the years that we've been doing the show, certain things come up more often than others. And I'm just really glad to give the topic at hand today around supporting students with disabilities, giving that its time, kind of going in depth with somebody who's a very strong advocate for that work. So we will get into our conversation starting out as we always do, having our guests introduce themselves and give a brief overview of their professional background and how they got to be where they are today.
Great. Thanks for having me, Dustin. So my name is Dr. Perry LaRoque. I am the founder and president of Mansfield Hall, which is a residential college support program for students with autism and other related disabilities. I'm also the author of Taking Flight, the Guide to College for Diverse Learners and Non-Traditional Students. But I sort of took a long educational path to get to where I am today. I started off as a special education teacher, taught for a few years, really enjoyed it, but found myself sort of stuck on the system, more focused on how I might be contributing to the problem than solving the problem. And so I was motivated to go back and continue my studies. And so I earned my doctorate in special education from the University of Wisconsin. After earning my doctorate, I spent about 7 years in academia as a professor for a few different universities, University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, SUNY Potsdam, and then ended up working as the special education program director for the graduate program at Northern Vermont University. And it was through that time that I just started to sort of see where some of our efforts at the college level were falling short of these diverse learners. And oftentimes, as my experience as an advisor, was that we were losing sight of these kids who really had a lot to offer and a really diverse perspective to bring to college, not because they weren't motivated and not because they weren't engaged and not because they couldn't manage the content. It was just all of the other skill set around them that was getting in their way of being a successful in college. And so, led me to co-found the College Steps program. We brought a Think College program, which is a program for students with intellectual disabilities to campus. The College Steps program sort of expanded those services and now is across the East Coast, serving students with disabilities at community colleges, and then eventually to start Mansfield Hall, which is, much more comprehensive. People describe us as like a super dorm. And so we have locations in Madison, Wisconsin, Burlington, Vermont, and Eugene, Oregon, where we work with the local colleges to help our students get the services that they need. And then we also help provide them the services on site, all under one roof.
Just on its face, and we can talk a little bit more about what Mansfield Hall does and everything as an organization, but like any student should be able to get a residential community that really invests, very deeply in the experience and everything. Because I think, anymore, just because of just kind of the scale and ubiquity of resident experiences, and schools just kind of, I don't know, maybe just kind of checking the box. They're just like, it's a place to live. You have some RAs. They're kind of just like monitoring and checking in, and like, they're not really going in as in depth in that sort of immersive learning experience, that opportunity that exists there. So it's really cool what you've been able to accomplish there so far. So yeah, if you just want to talk briefly about, what Mansfield Hall does in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I kind of came to the book through my work at Mansfield Hall. And so I'll say that a lot of the work that we were doing at Mansfield Hall was guided and inspired by my work both in the high schools and public education, and then also in the college level. And that was just quite simply, what does it take to be successful in college? It's not rocket science, but I literally sat down before I'd started Mansfield Hall and I said, what does a successful college student look like? And so I kind of boiled that down to what do we want? What are the outcomes of college? And they sort of fell into 4 domains. And both in the book and then also at Mansfield Hall, we kind of call these our 4 core areas, and it's learning, living, giving, and engaging. And so the learning obviously is the piece around students needing academic support and people to help them with their studies, the executive functioning piece, the advocacy piece with professors, kind of understanding how to manage the system, how to get their homework done, how to manage your schedule. But then you have these other categories like the living, like independent living skills and how important sleep hygiene and healthy eating and all of these pieces that support you in the classroom And then the engaging, how someone gets involved on a college campus, the social skills they develop from being in clubs and in intramural sports and political action committees, whatever it is, right? Getting involved on campus and having a social role. And then finally, this giving piece of, a successful college student volunteers and does internships and gets job related skills and gets different perspectives by volunteering at different organizations. And so my belief really was that we can't just focus on the learning. In fact, in many ways, I think the biggest mistake colleges are making is that they are overemphasizing the importance of tutoring and the learning aspect and forgetting that the independent living skills and the social skills and the real life experiences are really what provide the framework for someone to be able to learn in college. And so at Mansfield Hall, we have staff members within each of those categories. We have speech and language pathologists, we have academic coaches, we have writing specialists, we have academic directors. We have what we call our directors of student life, which are sort of like social workers that are helping to manage the overall system. And we have community outreach directors to help connect students to volunteering, which is a requirement, and get them involved in internships. And the goal is for us to become insignificant in the student's life. I mean, our goal is for a student to become independent so that we can hand them back to the college or hand them off to the college. So we've built them the skills that they need. We've helped them learn how to do college and then get them to a point where they can start to utilize those resources on campus. And the book, Taking Flight, was meant for those students and families that don't understand the system. College systems, the bureaucratic system of college itself is fairly complex, and students are at a significant disadvantage if they don't know how to use that system in their favor and how to kind of work the system. So what are the hidden rules? What are the different pieces you have to understand about college? How do you, manage a difficult situation with a professor? Like, how do you build relationships with your professors? All of these things that someone who's maybe come from generations of college students or, families who've all gone to college might be kind of secondhand nature of, like, if your professor tells you that there are no late assignments, like, that's fine, that's their rule. But did you ask them if you could have an exception? Little things like that I think help to level that playing field for diverse learners. And so, we sort of operate, and people find Mansfield Hall first, generally, and then we work with the colleges in the area. So let's use Burlington, Vermont. It was our first program as an example. Students come to Mansfield Hall. We have residents in the middle of town. It looks like any college residence. It's got a cafeteria. And then we sort of help match the students' desires and strengths to the colleges in the area. So we have, Community College of Vermont, Champlain College, and the University of Vermont. So we can kind of move students in between those different programs without being accepted yet, so they can kind of understand where their strengths are, where their challenges are, and we can find the right fit for them. And then move them around in real time too, if the big university was too much or the community college was not enough.
Let's play a game. What keywords does your website rank for? What doesn't it rank for that you think it should? What are a few opportunities you could be winning on if you tweaked some website copy? Okay, how'd you do? Not great? That's okay. Because our friends at DD Agency want to answer all of those questions for you and then some. DD Agency is a higher ed specific marketing technology agency that has conducted countless SEO audits for colleges and universities across the country. In these audits, they detail where you currently rank, what you could be ranking for, exactly how copy should be tweaked on website pages, and much more. If this sounds like something you could benefit from, give those folks a ping and be sure to mention that Enrollify sent you to claim a 10% discount on any of their SEO offerings. Head on over to enrollify.org/DDASEO or simply follow the link in the show notes below. That will guarantee you a 10% discount off of your audit. Again, head on over to enrollify.org/DDASEO to learn more. Now, on to the show. What I really like about that is, like, it feels very personalized, like, because I think, certainly some students may need more help in one area than another, and just thinking of kind of the archetypal residential experience for most students is kind of a one size fits all, and maybe there is a capacity to kind of give a student a more personalized experience, but just that idea that you have this whole team of people giving different areas of support to each student and everything. So you are just kind of taking best practices of what I think any residence life or student affairs professional like would hope to achieve, but just being able to kind of, do it and show the great results that you're giving to these students that you're working with is really great. But you've name dropped your book a couple of times, so I want to give that kind of its due attention here as well, because like you said, it's all kind of like interwoven and like the work
Yeah.
you've done for several years. And so you have the book and now also a podcast called Taking Flight. So I'm just curious, just generally, like, obviously you've been really immersed in this work and are now kind of putting it out with these different kind of content mediums and everything, so just like talking about how these came to be and what the experience has been like putting this out into the world.
Let me back up and just comment on one thing that you said. And yes, I've been trained very well to name drop the book, so I'm glad that came through. The people who are at a college, and I say this oftentimes, is that people have the best intentions. And I've worked on campuses, and certainly we all have the best intentions of meeting the needs of our students. And oftentimes it's the system that in of itself that can be discriminatory against students with disabilities. And you're right, like we have this huge amount of resources where we can kind of wrap around these students, and colleges actually have really good programs and really good services and really good centers. And a lot of times I think you get a lot of colleges that are head scratching because they're like, well, we have a great writing center, we have a great disability services, we have a great counseling center, they have all these wonderful services, and it's still not enough, and people can't figure that out, that why. And I often say, well, the most difficult thing we do at Mansfield Hall is wake students up, right? And I say that both in reality and metaphorically to a large extent, is that you can bring the horse to water, right? But you have to, you can't make them drink. I always say our students are thirsty. They just don't know how to get to the water. And so it's about how are we helping them find those services and use those services. And that's the key point. It's not necessarily that resident life coordinator needs to do all the work that we do, but they need to understand what the student needs and how to get them the support that they need. And so, what Mansfield Hall does in a large way is we help connect students to those services on campus that are really great services. When they show up as a freshman and you expect them to go from having an IEP team with 7 professionals on it, helping them guide their program and tell them what to do every day of their life, to being a freshman in college where they're completely on their own and have to create their own team, it's just a pretty big ask for a student who's coming into their freshman year. So I know the colleges are struggling with it, and I feel like the solution is there. It's just sort of a change in paradigm. One of the inequities of students with disabilities at the college level is that they lose all of their support. IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, dictates and funds special education programs up to the age of 20, 21, 22, if you need them that long, but up to the graduate high school. And that pays for speech and language, it pays for coaching, it pays for testing, it pays for all these things. When a student goes to college, that line of funding completely deteriorates. There's nothing there. There's very few scholarships out there. There's very few grants. There's very little for these students. So even just weekly coaching for a student oftentimes comes out of a family's, bank account. And Mansfield Hall, because we're offering this huge amount of services to our students, ends up being expensive, and families don't necessarily have a way or anywhere to go to help pay for that. And we certainly don't have anywhere to go to, offset the costs on our end, because there's really no lines of funding for these kinds of kids out there. And, and that's been something as a public school teacher, and came from a education family. My dad was a school psychologist and a camp director. My mom was a preschool teacher, is concerning for me, because you see that perpetuating those inequities. And so the second half of what I've been doing with my life now is trying to figure out ways that we can start to open these doors for these students without them having to afford a program like Mansfield Hall or any of the other programs across the country. Even the programs on campuses that still charge more on top of the tuition is out of reach for many families. For me, it was, why don't I just take everything that we're doing at Mansfield Hall and all of my observations as a professor and an advisor and put it into a book. And, originally I think the running title was The Insider's Guide to College, because it's not about like, how do you study and how do you take notes? It's about what's the difference between an associate dean and an assistant dean, and that's the most boring part of all of it, but really understanding how the system works in order for someone to understand how they can get through it and get around it, and also putting into context their own disability and how that fits into college, or their own diverse learning needs and how that fits into the college atmosphere, and why colleges weren't built for that student. In fact, there's a chapter called It Wasn't Made for You. I mean, colleges weren't made for these kinds of kids. And so now you're coming to this college, you're doing it on your own. How do you do it? And so the book was really meant to be a way of trying to give families and students the knowledge they need in order to survive and be successful in college, and hopefully the inspiration to do it. I tried to make it as not dry as possible. So the book, I've been told, is funny and keeps people engaged, and sort of talks about the things students need to think about.
You got to bring that humanity to it. Like, this is just like, because I
Mhm.
think just continually acknowledging and realizing like college and, choosing it and going to it and being, being in college and everything, like it's all just very emotional. Like it's just, for so many people, like, affirming life goals, or it's a, uh where a place where you find your identity, and you're making these bonds and being vulnerable about like what you don't know, and you're learning, and all these sort of things. So I think, yeah, you kind of have to bring the, the humor and the emotion and just sort of the genuine nature to things. And it's great too, because I just always appreciate folks who kind of like show their work and almost like don't like hog it. They can kind of just be like, hey, like this is what's been working for me, like, you know
Yeah.
what with what I've been doing and everything. And certainly, like, it's not as if it's like everywhere needs to do it exactly like yours, kind of model and everything. Like, you can kind of remix it and mash it up and kind of, find something that works for, um, their context and environment as like a, higher institution. But I'm just, as a quick follow up, as a fellow podcaster, I'm curious, like, what has that experience been like for you to kind of like, which I think is great, kind of keep the conversation going under the banner of,
Yeah.
the book title and everything, just like, because just for a lot of folks, like it's another area of vulnerability, of kind of like putting your literal voice out there and having these conversations and everything. So, what
Yeah.
was that experience like? Been like?
Well, it was fun. And honestly, I'm a busy person. And so the pandemic provided me with, more time than I was comfortable with. And so, that podcast came out of I should do something because I have more time on my hands now, even though in a lot of ways, the life was a lot busier. I just had some more like at home time, like the rest of us, like everybody else. And one of the things that in my career, working with people with disabilities, is that oftentimes it's their voice that is missing from the conversations. And I think there's a saying in special education, nothing about us without us. And, meaning like we should really be involving the voices of people with disabilities in all of this. And, I just got curious. I was looking at podcasts saying, well, like what podcast just features the stories of people with disabilities and what they're up to, not necessarily about like what is their disability, but like what did they do and how did they get through it, and put together a wish list of people that I wanted to talk to. I ended up being able to interview Temple Grandin for, we talked for a couple hours. And it was more about how is disability a part of your life, and it was interesting because, and anybody who's listened to the podcast says, the one theme that kind of comes through that is that these people don't view themselves as having the disability in the way we do, that they view their disability as the interaction between the expectations of the world and their personal characteristics, and that if the world wasn't in their way, they would be just fine. Sina Baram, who I interviewed, who's this web developer who's blind, was like, listen, I'm fine. Like, I mean, it's the sight world that's in my way. Like, if there wasn't an expectation for me to be able to see, I would be able to do everything else everybody is able to do. And it's when the world is created in a way that I can't access that it becomes a problem. And, right down to Temple Grandin saying, listen, my autism was a strength. Being a woman was hard, in the cattle industry. Or Drew Maxwell, who is a movie producer and he's done a bunch of movies and is an artist and the executive director of the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, was like, school largely failed me because they wanted me to do all the things I couldn't do and didn't let me focus on the things I was really good at. And
Mhm.
so it wasn't that my dyslexia was necessarily the problem. My dyslexia makes me a amazing artist and it makes me a really unique person. It's just that when people require me to read and write, it gets in my way. It's sort of brought all that perspective. And that's the perspective that our students at Mansfield Hall have oftentimes. It's like, these are really nice, motivated, engaged, smart. Their perspectives on the world are fascinating and in a lot of ways just beautiful. And it's like we put them into this college system that's not created for that kind of person. And all they're doing is battling to be themselves. And so I think the podcast was sort of like, let me get these voices of these people out there who have taken their disability and done great things with it. And so that other people with disabilities and other practitioners can understand that oftentimes this deficit perspective on disability is the problem, not necessarily the person who has it.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think that's really powerful because also I think it, in my mind, connects a dot of like you're kind of already seeing just like broadly an acknowledgement of like how we allow learners to showcase their learning starting to get a little bit more fluid, where you can have something. I guess I don't want to say like a spectrum necessarily. Like, there's just kind of like a whole sort of like you know kind of diagram of options, I guess, for any incident. Because like it's anywhere from just like, okay, you need to do a discussion board post. It's like you could write, you could record a voice memo, you could like do a video or whatever it is. Like, you just allow people, that's going to built in anymore into a lot of learning management systems where it's like, yeah, you don't need to just like write your response. You could do whatever you want. But then like on a much more larger scale, something like competency based education, where it's just like, okay, like you can prove that you know your stuff, you are getting credit for that, so that you're already kind of moving towards an area where it's like, okay, you're now caught up in terms of your like degree program to where you're actually at based on your prior knowledge, and we kind of set up a structure for you to showcase that and everything. So yeah, I think just like if we're doing more of that, it better serves more diverse learners kind of from all corners of the world and everything, depending on yeah, if it's an adult learner coming to college after working their career for a while, or yeah, like a student who's coming in where they have some other different ability status or something. You're allowing them to kind of showcase their knowledge. And yeah, like you said, I think that's kind of like the through line here is like kind of getting out of their way, because yeah, there's a lot of uh, just sort of entrenched biases, and certainly sometimes I'm sure just like things that people are unaware of because they've just kind of become so much of the kind of the paradigm and the status quo and everything. So um well, I think I'll move to this question just because I think it'll capture a lot of what um, I want to talk about, so we can sit with this for as long as we need to. But just sort of like to try to crystallize this, because I think you've sprinkled it throughout in terms of kind of your advice of that you'd give to institutions um, in this area, but certainly acknowledging that they may be grappling with limited resources. But like, if it is sort of like maybe those small pivots or things to be looking into or researching or those sort of things, just what advice would you give institutions with limited resources to try to do their best to be supportive of these students?
It's a great question. And I actually do a fair number of trainings at colleges. And so this is the question, right? And I'll get asked to come and do an hour-long training on how to work with kids with autism in the classroom. And I just, it always drives me a little nuts because it's like, hey, I got a doctorate in this stuff. It took me it took me 5 years
Just sum
to
it up all in an hour. Thanks. Yeah.
like an hour, yeah. And I think faculty are sick of hearing like, this is what autism is, and this is what people with autism do, because anybody that, as Temple Grandin says, anybody who's met one person with autism has met one person with autism. When I go onto campuses, I try to like reframe. One is that it's going to take more than just we need better academic services, or it's going to take more than just like we need to hire more people for our counseling services. That it's got to be a campus wide approach, and it's got to be a paradigm flip. I mean, if we think about public schools, we don't have the choice of who we can and can't educate, and so we hopefully are doing the best by everybody who's there. And that mentality, largely goes away with colleges, because colleges, you're entering into them with some expectation that you have a certain set of skills, and those skills are all academic and personal life and independent living skills, and all those other pieces are outside of the purview of the college. So in a lot of ways, we have colleges who are struggling to get more students, and I've talked about this in a blog I wrote a few years back. But you have colleges who are at a greater pressure to recruit more students. So they
Mhm.
recruit more students. They end up being more diverse students. They bring them into a campus telling them that they have all the services that they possibly need. They on a campus who has underfunded college services that can't handle all these students and can't follow them out the door, which is the biggest issue, or can't wake them up in the morning or whatever it is to get them into their office. So they start to lose those students. And then you have an administration who wants to then focus on retention and cut funding for academic services. And then the loop kind of just swings back around. It's like this vicious circle. And largely, I think that what we think of as in campuses is like, hey, we have a disability problem, and let's solve the problem for these kids with disabilities. And in general, I think it's bigger than that. People with disabilities tend to illuminate the larger problems with the way that we've structured colleges, and that is this competitive, weed people out mentality of, let's make the course content hard and let's curve scores and put people here and put people there. And it's really meant to kind of like bring out the best and brightest for this competitive job market versus thinking more about the focus on the individual learner and what does that learner need. And oftentimes, if we can assume that everyone who you've accepted into a college can learn the material, well, you have this opportunity to teach someone the material, but you also have to work with the things they bring to the table. And so with small colleges, oftentimes I say everything that you have on campus, and small colleges have some advantages, is that everything that you have on this campus in terms of support, writing centers, math labs, tutoring, note takers, disability services, these are all the services these kids need, but you have to understand that they can't get to them unless someone can help them figure out how to get there. And I mean that both, physically and also emotionally. Right. And so how are we wrapping our services around all of these students, giving all of the students the opportunity to get the support and services that they need? How are we getting ahead of mental health issues on campuses by helping students, everybody with their executive functioning challenges? How are we helping students think about their wellness? How are we helping students think about when they're struggling and what can they do about it? And then, quite frankly, there is this, I say to college campuses and professors oftentimes that when you know what your student needs, recommending it is never going to be enough. If you know a student really needs help with writing, or if you have a student who's in class who's depressed, saying you should go to the counseling center is a great suggestion, but it's not enough, right? If we really want to make a difference on college campuses, we have to be an engaged community to say, you need to go to counseling services. I know somebody there. Let me meet you after class and let's walk there together and I'll introduce you, because that's that kind of piece that some of these students actually need to use that kind of services and supports and the follow-ups. And so just as an overall campus, it's a question of like, how do we create these teams around students so that we're not losing them between the cracks? And how can we make sure that they're effectively utilizing the support the campus actually already has? It's not necessarily about building this new tutoring center and then saying, oh, we have a great new tutoring center. You still have to get people to walk through the door. And so how are we going to get them to walk through the door and use the services? One of my colleagues, who's our admissions director, he often tells families there's only 3 questions that we need to ask for college readiness. And the first question is, does your son or daughter know when they need help? And do they know that early enough? And are they able to accurately identify what they need help with? The second question is, do they know where to get that help? And the third question is, do they know how to use it? And if you answer no to any one of those 3 questions, that kid's going to struggle in college. And so for colleges to think about the answers to those questions too, right? How are we helping students know when they're struggling? How are we helping those students understand where they get help for that? And how are we helping them use those services on an ongoing and meaningful basis? And that's that level of work that we need to do. But if the focus is on the learner and our focus is on retention and making sure that we're preparing the students that are on campus for the next step in life, that there's going to take a different level of focus on what learning entails than just providing more tutoring and more training on what autism is for your professors.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, what it's making me think of is like something that keeps kind of circling in my mind is like there's been so much work on making college accessible to students, like, trying to just like market a lot and get as many students in as possible, but then yeah, like either resources to support them while they're there aren't as accessible, all matters of the word, as they should be, or like how you're kind of detailing, like there's not really like a supportive ecosystem, like there's not kind of the tools and infrastructure to kind of do that kind of wraparound support so that I don't know, just like everybody's on the same page and, everybody can be aware, just even like kind of digitally, that version, maybe what you're kind of talking about of like walking someone to the, counseling center, just as we have more like hybrid and online students where it can be like, okay, I can at least like mark in the student's like activity log, like sent referral to this person or whatever. So then we can be like, hey, I know that your advisor, did X, Y, or Z a couple of weeks ago. Like, did you get a chance to do what they asked you to do or whatever? Like, and just those sort of things. So I think that's, yeah, just great advice, and that's some of those areas of like culture change where there's like certainly, there may not be like an explicit cost, maybe besides time, like there's not like maybe a huge dollar sign to it, but like those are the things that, and I also always try to capture it this way, is like helps you be better, supportive, and retain all students, whether they are, from any diverse background or an adult learner or an online learner, commuter student, like whoever it is. I think these are sort of the uh, kind of cultural pivots and, sort of systems and everything that need to kind of adapt, to this moment.
Yeah, and I'll just let me jump in there and say that I taught special education history for a long time, which is just a great course to teach. But we are repeating the same mistake of the '70s right now with colleges. And my hope is that we're repeating the same mistakes, but we're also going to solve that problem eventually too. And basically, it was when we made mandatory special education, when we basically said all students get this free and appropriate public education, and we had to provide services for students in schools. What we did was do all these separate things, right? Oh, well, great. We'll have a learning disability classroom and we'll shove all the kids with learning disabilities into one classroom and we'll teach them there, which was probably better than nothing, in
Mhm.
terms of them not being included in the public schools. But we learned very quickly, well, actually, I didn't say very quickly. It took us a decade or so to figure out that self-contained model was ineffective. And so we started saying what students need to be educated in their least restrictive environment. And we started doing a lot more work in the actual general education classrooms. And we wanted to kind of get rid of these self-contained classrooms. We're seeing colleges make this same mistake right now, right? They want to serve more students with autism, which is great. And so the way we do that is we're going to create a program and we're going to accept 15 students with autism into our program every year, and they're going to have their own special program, and they're going to meet in the cafeteria together, and they're going to meet in the office. And I think it's better than nothing. Like I do, but it is also in my mind, it's a little bit of a cop out because we know more now with Universal Design for Learning, which is a great training program for faculty, that we shouldn't be doing this, what we used to call differentiated education. Like we shouldn't be doing differentiated instruction. We shouldn't be saying, oh, well, kids with disabilities learn this way and kids without disabilities learn that way, because we know there's no science to back that. We know that good teaching, good education, good training of faculty, and good services benefit all students on campus. And so rather than spending thousands and thousands of dollars on creating a separate program, let's put in all that money to figure out how do we make a campus more accessible to students with autism, and how do we make classrooms more accessible to students with autism, and how do we help them navigate the services and supports on campus to do so, and how do we do that for all of our students, because we know that retention is going to go up for everybody. You look at like University of Vermont, Dr. Jim Hujak had created the learning and living community that was focused around mindfulness and healthy habits, and you see all the students who really wanted, they desired that, and the positive incomes or outcomes that came out of that were just great for all of these students, whether they had a disability or not. And so as a college campus, how do we start to change the whole paradigm to say, how are we a more open campus for everybody? Not necessarily how do we do really well with our, gifted and talented students, and then how do we have a separate program for our students with disabilities? Because the world doesn't work that way, and it certainly doesn't, it's not as effective for students with disabilities.
Great takeaways here. And yeah, as we're winding down, I do want to make sure we give time to our two kind of standard final questions. So we definitely have ways to connect with you and your book and your podcast, and certainly the universal design resource that you mentioned as well. But anything else that you want to name drop really quick? Any other additional resources on this topic that we can include in the show notes?
Yeah, I mean, my website, perrylaroque.com, and it's LAROQUE. That's got a lot of, just sort of a good landing spot for a lot of these different resources and how to get in touch with me or how to buy the book. The book's on Amazon, of course. And in your local bookstores, and the podcast is on my website. And sort of all over. I'd also say another good resource is the College Autism Network. They're a wonderful group of people who are really doing their best to highlight different programs and services and supports around the country. It's a good place to kind of check that out, especially if you're interested in autism. Overall, I would say is that there's a huge community out there that's working on this topic. 10 years ago when we started Mansfield Hall, I think we were one of like 10 programs in the country. And now there's over 300, specifically around post-secondary education. And so I think that there's a big movement in this direction. I hope colleges start to see the disability as diversity when they're starting to think of DEI. Read a great article about it should be DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, which would make me really happy. And I think that what we've seen is that when we give these students the opportunity, they take it. Mansfield Hall, we see about a 70% college completion rate, which is higher than the average for students without disabilities. Students with disabilities finish college at a rate of about 20%. And so it's really dire for students who are doing it without that support. And so how can we start to think of colleges as a place of learning? And if we're a place of learning, how are we going to focus on those learners to be successful?
Yeah. I mean, and then I guess I could tee you up for another sort of final thought or call to action here as we usually do, but I feel like you shared such a good one there. But I mean, we'll just keep you giving you sort of the platform here to kind of
Keep me
spit out
going.
these amazing morsels here because yeah, I mean, I think this is such a kind of refreshing and very relevant perspective and really capturing kind of objectively like that stat and figure too, where like you know you've been at this work for like a decade and getting like that huge positive gain, but obviously there's still a lot of work to be done because it's like, yeah, I mean, we would hope to like get it as close to 100%, graduation rate as possible. So like, just keeping, that fire burning. And I think to build on that quick little metaphor, like I'm sure as others, looking back like 10 years kind of have lit that torch to light the way for so many other people to see like, oh wow, like this is possible. Like, and as kind of an eternal optimist, like even seeing through kind of the tragedies of the past 2 years of the pandemic and how much that really disrupted people's lives and everything, to me it was also one of those opportunities where it could kind of light the way to be like, see, if we just like through sheer force of will say that like we're going to do this and we follow it through, like we could do some pretty amazing things to actually help uplift people out of poverty and
Yeah.
fund what I believe are sort of really important aspects of kind of a caring society and all that. But yeah, I will still give you the floor here if you want to wrap everything up. Final thoughts.
Ultimately, it's going to have to come down to legislation and funding. I mean, and that's the answer. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of small colleges that are listening that are like, oh, this would be great if we had the money to do it. And I agree. You can't put you can't put this on the backs of these small colleges. The big colleges, I think, have less of an excuse. The small colleges who are doing their best with what they have, you can't expect them to start putting in this huge amount of effort for potentially what all of these students are going to need because they're struggling to survive already. You'd like to think if we're going to say that the American dream is going to college, that the American dream is for all kids, not just kids without disabilities. And so we need to put our money where our mouth is. And, we need to be able to provide support for these kids. I mean, like I said, the inequities in terms of students requiring additional support in college, it's not about, expensive programs like Mansfield Hall. There's families who can't afford tuition, period. And if they are affording tuition, or racking up student debt, to add on $150 an hour coaching on top of that is out of reach for many, many families across this country. And so we're seeing this huge amount of inequity and discrimination against students with disabilities in order to earn those college degrees. But yet we're still demanding that people get a college degree in this country in order to live the American dream. And so I think colleges need to, stop the bleeding and do what they can to help these kids out. They're here. They're excited, they're engaged, they're motivated, they want to give back, they want to not be takers, they want to be givers. And we're going to do the whole society a huge favor if we can help them achieve their goals, because it's what we're hoping for as well. So, I'm excited for the day when Mansfield Hall and other programs like ours are irrelevant, because why would we do something separate when the college is open and welcoming to all students and meet them where they're at?
Right. Well, and I think just being kind of, doing what you're doing. Like it could be just like, oh, like this is sort of a blueprint to adapt. And then, yeah, it's creating an environment that is more inclusive and supportive of all learners' success and everything. But you've at least kind of, uh, you know, shown again, like kind of shown the way a bit. And yeah, I mean, my hope would be, because I know there's sort of a long overdue, sort of renewal of like higher education acts and, these sort of broader measures where, that could be like such an opportunity in so many different ways to really uh, have higher ed better reflect kind of uh, the present day and best practices and just sort of, what a modern learners look like and what do they need and how could we kind of uh, create kind of a ecosystem that better funds that and just creates more of the opportunities like what you're kind of working on, what you're advocating for. And we will end it there, though. Thank you so much for sharing all that you did, Perry. And again, we'll have ways to connect with you and everything that you mentioned in the show notes as usual. Yeah, just thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Justin. I really appreciate it.
Hey y'all, Zach here from Enrollify. If you like this podcast, chances are you'll like other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing by the month, and we've got a plethora of marketing, admissions, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks that are all designed to empower you to become a better higher ed professional. Our shows feature a selection of the industry's best as your hosts. Learn from Mickey Baines, Jeremy Tears, Jaime Hunt, Corinne Myers, Jamie Gleason, and many, many more. You can learn more about the Enrollify Podcast Network at podcasts.enrollify.org. Our shows help higher ed marketers and admissions professionals find their next big idea. Find yours at podcasts.enrollify.org.